Holly is the advancement director for the Dogwood Alliance, which is based in North Carolina. She's actually a lifelong activist, starting at age 13, and she began as an activist in the LGBTQ and the HIV/AIDS movements, and she's made for herself a life of service for and spiritual reflection into careers, that have spanned social justice, youth empowerment, outdoor leadership, and now forest protection. So at the Dogwood Alliance, she's, as I said, the advancement director, but what that means is that she's out there working with the communities that are on the front lines in the South and in the Southeast, whose communities are being flooded by the destruction of the forests uphill, and of course by the force of hurricanes coming in. And we're going to learn from her and from the folks who'll be at her workshop about the amazing work, community building and forest protection work that's going on. So, ready for stories and for Holly. Take it away, Holly.
Thank you so much, Paula. That was a lovely introduction. Thank you. So a few little logistics to get out of the way first. And I think we've heard it a couple times. But if you are on mute, hopefully you're on mute. I can't be on mute, so if you hear cats meowing and cars driving by, you'll just, it'll be part of the fun in the background. There is a participant panel at the bottom of your Zoom, and if you would like to raise your hand at any time during the presentation, at the end I'm going to open up that panel and I'll go through and hopefully pronounce your names correctly and ask you for your questions. And then of course folks who want to ask questions in addition to that, they'll have the opportunity to do so. Also, please note that at the end of the presentation, which is, it's me, slideshow, I'm not doing any song and dance in the middle, although I might feel like it, that there will be a couple of slides at the end that are resource slides for you. And feel free to screenshot those on your computer or take pictures of them with your phone, however you would like, because you'll be able to have immediate access to go online and read more stories and be more inspired, hopefully. So that's my little logistic little bit there. I am so grateful to be with you here today. My journey here is an interesting one. As I mentioned before Paula started us off at 10:30, that Reverend Dele has spoken before about Dogwood Alliance's work, and she knows Dana Smith, our executive director, quite well. And Dana Smith, at the beginning of the year, her April was so blocked out with events that she asked me, she said, she said, this is really kind of your bailiwick, to use that word again. And I'm going to be really busy. I may be in DC on this date, and would you be willing to do it? And I was very honored that she entrusted me with that, and that's why I'm here today. And I'm grateful not just to be here with you, but to be in this particular moment of blessed unrest across the planet. I will have to say that I got a message literally while Paula was talking that one of my best friends' cousins overdosed this morning, early this morning. And it is just another reminder of the suffering that goes on. And not just the health suffering that goes on at this time, but the mental health suffering that happens, that occurs. So if I get teary by anything that I say, it's because that is very much on my heart. And I've lit a candle in the background to remember her cousin as I speak. I'm also grateful that this underground current of unity that I'm usually too busy to feel is very much with me, as I'm sure it is for many of you. I'm grateful for all my connections with people and to the planet. And I'm grateful that 48 years after Rachel Carson's Silent Spring was published, that the birds are actually louder than we are. In the middle of a vision poster that's tacked to the back of my bedroom door, which I know is a collegiate kind of a thing to do, is a quote by Blaise Pascal that I found years ago. And it says, all of humanity's problems stem from the inability to sit quietly in a room alone. It's no small thing right now that billions of us have more time to do this than ever before across the entire planet. It is indeed a unique opportunity and begs the question, what are we going to do with it? What changes might we be able to create? What new world could emerge? How can we emerge? And where might this underground current of unity possibly take us? So this presentation, let me share screen. Let me do my due diligence here. There we go. You all see that well? So the community-led movement for forest, climate, and justice in the South. This presentation is a snapshot of what's happening at the front lines of the forest, climate, and justice movement in the South. It's a story of Dogwood Alliance for sure. And I'll introduce our organization to you in a few minutes in the presentation. It's also the story about our partners and our journey with them. And it is also my story as advancement director and being part of this movement over the past several years. Communities are coming together to cut down lies and protect the trees. I love this quote. I pulled it from Paul Hawkins' book, Blessed Unrest, from the beginning of his chapter entitled The Long Green. And I couldn't think of a better quote that would provide a framework for this story. The unified efforts of communities across the South are a microcosm of Blessed Unrest, part of the current of unity rising across the globe. And my hope is that you will be excited and inspired to know more because there is a lot to know. After a little contextual background about Southern forests, which may or may not blow your mind, I hope they do, they still blow my mind. I'm going to share some stories about the efforts of Frontline Communities with whom Dogwood is privileged to work, and then wrap up with some resources and suggestions before Q&A. But first, let's talk about some of these lies that are being challenged. First of all, that our systems and ideologies are working. We can all maybe chuckle a little sarcastically about that. But it's really true that there are just more systems that meet the eye that aren't working. Our forestry systems aren't working. Our legal systems, our government policies aren't working. And obviously they may or may not work to a greater or lesser extent. But without challenging them, doubting them, and reworking them at every turn, we can seemingly become powerless and at their mercy. Another lie that's being cut down that we often tell ourselves is that quantified value is more important than individual impact. For those of you who have written grants and grant reports, you should be familiar with terms such as measurement and the dreaded evaluation methodology. We've learned to equate being a recipient of resources for our good work with numbers. And we're always having to ask the question, how much can I do? What do they want? Am I going to be able to quantify the results of my good work enough, even though the small efforts that I make and the small gains that I make may actually make more of an impact as time goes on. And the last lie that's being questioned and cut down is that we lack what we need to create change. And I actually think that in my personal journey, this is one of the most pervasive and crushing lies we buy into, right? If only thinking ranges from the stories we tell ourselves about not having enough money or power or time to thinking that we can't possibly make headway when there's so much division amongst us, or when we're in survival mode, or even now when we're confined to our homes. So I'm going to go quickly over this next part. It's what you might know and might not know about Southern forests, but it is fun. And in order to grasp the enormity of the movement that's occurring, I want you to know what's at stake. First of all, is that the South and the Southern forests are a globally recognized ecological hotspot. That the forests of 14 Southern states are home to creatures found nowhere else on the planet. And that these forests include 35 million acres of wetland forests AKA swamps, because I've had people ask, what are wetland forests? And I was like, swamps. They provide clean drinking water for millions of people, and they serve as massive defense systems against erosion and flooding from increasingly powerful storms as a result of climate change. And we know that those hurricanes that Paula mentioned before have been ravaging the South for years now. And indeed, many of the communities that are on the front lines of industry are also on the front lines for being impacted the most by hurricanes and by flooding. And that these forests are also home to some of the oldest trees on the planet. In fact, recently discovered a 2,000, now just get this, is, if you haven't heard about this already, 2,624-year-old bald cypress tree in a swamp, aka wetland forest in southeastern North Carolina. 2,600 years old. There was an article that was published in the Charlotte Observer, and I will paraphrase what they said, is that that's before Christianity, the Roman Empire, and the English language, just to give a little context. And that's a tree just downstate from me. It's pretty miraculous. So, but did you know these things? That the southeastern United States is considered the fiber basket of the world, that more products and byproducts come from trees in the southern US than anywhere else in the world, and that just 7% of our forests are more than 80 years old. My mom, who is 83 now, decided when she was 80 that she wanted a t-shirt with this statistic on it as a conversation starter, except it would read only 7% of our southern forests are older than I am. Our forests are also 4 times more degraded than South American rainforests. And I think that this takes people by surprise. But you have to think that the South used to be virgin forests. And after centuries of landscape level extraction and the logging of those forests and converting them to pine plantations, which is basically to say crops, you know, we have degraded soils, we have degraded forests, we don't have the kind of mixed hardwood forest, and obviously longleaf pine and some of those other things that were prevalent across the South. And pine plantations, for obvious reasons, don't support the diversity of life the way mixed forests and natural stands do. And I also put on here that we're overwhelmingly privately owned, because this is something interesting. We often talk about the diversity disconnect, and that the amount of land that's conserved in the South is actually much less than is conserved in the Northwest, and yet the biodiversity is greater in the South. We have lots of tax incentives for people who privately own their land to actually log their land. And there's a lack of incentivization for landowners who actually want to keep their forest growing and intact. Oh, there we go. I was just like, what happened to everything? I didn't take it off of doing that, so I clicked everything on for you. So founded in 1996 as a response to proliferating wood chip mills in the southern US, Dogwood Alliance was founded. And we mobilized diverse voices to protect forests from industrial logging. And we do that in a variety of ways. We partner with Frontline Communities to challenge logging. We partner to create policy changes, both domestically and overseas, through research, on-the-ground investigations, which are a lot of fun, which means staff get into like muck boots and truck through wetland forests and take pictures, and as well as movement building. And we support opportunities for the creation of alternative economic solutions to logging for communities. What we focus on. So we focus on ending industrial biomass, which is what Paula referred to earlier. So this practice in the South often involves clear-cutting forests that are then turned into pellets and shipped across to Europe to be burned to generate electricity. Now, we're not talking about pellet stoves here. We're talking about millions of tons of pellets burned in power stations as a replacement for coal, a practice that's been given the green light by many countries in the EU, as well as here on the domestic front. And this carbon neutral stamp of approval, however, is based on faulty carbon accounting, which I'm not going to go into here, but if you're curious, there's a resource that I put at the end of the presentation for the film Burned Are Trees the New Coal, which very thoroughly goes through that carbon accounting process. But where do these trees come from that are being turned into pellets and burned for electricity? Well, they largely come from Black and brown communities in the South, who are already disproportionately suffering from pollution by other egregious industries. This is a relatively new threat for forests, which has really popped up just in the last decade. But the enormity of it makes it dangerous, as does its faulty fundamental premise that because we can regrow trees, that it's a green solution for power, right? So backed by millions of marketing bucks, industrial biomass really wants us to believe that it's green, even when it requires subsidies to exist and it's dirtier at the smokestack than coal is. So in order to meet this new threat, Dogwood Alliance started the Our Forests Aren't Fuel campaign in 2013. But our work to protect wetland forests has its roots in Our Forests Aren't Fuel campaign, as many of the forests that are being cut down in the South are actually wetland forests, which are irreplaceable. After all, how do you replace a 2,600-year-old tree? To create solutions for this gap in protection in 2017, we brought together diverse groups across the region to form the Wetland Forest Initiative. Traditional landowner groups, now get this because this is so cool. Traditional landowner groups sat at the same table with tribal representatives, conservation organizations, and justice groups. The process took a bit, but 3 years later, the coalition has put together a strategy by consensus to protect the most critical of these wetland forest acres, especially along waterways and in watersheds like the PD River Basin. Our strategy was published last year, and I include a website for that in case you want to look into that more. So since starting the Our Forests Aren't Fuel campaign in 2013, and this is really where this presentation begins, much of our work has been with Frontline Communities. This has been very different from our decades of previous work, successfully organizing consumer protests and negotiating with paper company execs in boardrooms to adopt more sustainable practices. Now, new pellet mills are springing up all the time, and existing pellet mills are expanding, many of them by Enviva, the world's largest pellet exporter, which just last year announced plans for their newest facility in Lucedale, Mississippi, the largest pellet mill in the world. Our partnership with these communities has led us on a great eye-opening and transformative adventure, as we have been invited to join and then help lead in the unifying movement for forest, climate, and justice. So in 2015, we discovered that one of Enviva's new pellet mills was destined to be built in Richmond County, North Carolina, southeast of Charlotte, North Carolina. That's the community that mill was slated to be built in was already one suffering from the impacts of numerous other industries, including a power plant, Duke Power Plant, and a chicken processing plant. Asthma rates in the county were already astronomical for the state even, and the children and adults alike suffered from other health issues. And yet, the county politicians were overwhelmingly in favor of the new mill, which they argued, yes, it might bring a little particulate matter and noise pollution, but that was a small price to pay for new jobs and economic growth. That trade-off, health for economy, it sounds familiar because it is familiar. It's something that has been pervasive. Maybe we're collectively acknowledging and seeing it more during COVID-19 as we see so many Black and brown communities suffering from higher death rates, from higher infection rates, and not getting the kind of health treatment that they need. This isn't something new. It's something that's been around all the time. And in most cases, if there is the potential to say yes to some kind of short-term economic gain, then that is what's going to be voted for largely by white commissioners and counties at the expense of Black and brown communities. Over the next year, we worked with residents and community leaders in Richmond County to educate, provide resources, write articles, and garner support. This is a community who didn't want their forests raised for fuel. And they didn't want the lungs of their children to suffer even more. Thousands across the state ended up signing petitions. Dozens commented at public hearings from their community, from nearby communities, and spoke from courthouse steps. In the end, though, sadly, we didn't stop the mill, nor did we stop the expansion that occurred later, although we did manage to get tighter restrictions on the mill's air quality. You would think that the defeat was absolute, but instead it started something really big. not just for residents who are unified and still fighting, but ultimately for the entire biomass campaign. Because that was the start of something that was an effort over many months working with partners to educate North Carolina Governor Cooper's office. And last year, they published the most robust anti-biomass policy statement in the country. It was published as part of Cooper's Clean Energy Plan. It directly states that industrial biomass will not be a part of the state's energy future. And I think more importantly, it also calls for the questioning of the carbon accounting of biomass on a national and international level. It's not perfect, but it's a beginning. It's a government entity in a vast exporting state at that, saying we're not so sure that we buy into the carbon accounting methods that these industries are saying is so green. But that wasn't all. Dogwood Alliance, we as a staff, as an organization, we learned some important lessons of what it means to partner with a frontline community. As a largely white-staffed, well-resourced environmental organization, we learned that this movement would not be about leading, but about listening. That it wouldn't be about keeping tight schedules and giving polished presentations in boardrooms, but it would be about unplanned phone calls and being present for stories told at community picnics. It would not be about what we could do, but what we could do together. So one thing leads to another. And during our campaign with Richmond County, we were introduced to one of my favorite people, Reverend Leo Woodbury, who's the founder of the New Alpha Community Development Corporation. Reverend Woodbury, Reverend Leo, Rev Leo, call him lots of things, has a long history of working for justice and environmental justice. And soon he and our executive director, Dana Smith, were talking nearly every day about the threats to forests in the South, the implications of forest protection as a safeguard against climate change, and most importantly, how all justice issues are related: racial, indigenous, women's, marriage, economic, health, climate, forests, nature. Gathered together at a large table with flip charts at a public library in Florence, South Carolina, where Reverend Leo calls home, in December of 2017, we had our first forays in mapping out a bold idea. Bold idea became the Justice First Tour. Between the vast networking and organizational contacts Reverend Leo had across the South from his decades of work, and those of Dogwood Alliance and Sierra Club chapters, that idea manifested into a tour which visited over 22 cities across 13 states in 2018. Communities gathered to discuss their most pressing issues and how to solve them together. We were all under one banner. We met in churches, in community buildings, parks. It didn't really matter. We listened to speakers. We heard local music and spoken word. We witnessed the graduations of students from Green Jobs programs. We prayed with Unitarians, Baptists, Methodists, Episcopalians. We talked about families and health, jobs, climate, and yes, forests. So I talked to Rev Leo on the phone just this past Friday night, and I asked him what he took away from the tour, now that it's been almost 2 years, that inspired him the most. And he knew I was doing this today. So we talked a little bit about that. And he told me that he was surprised how many people got it. And how many people actually understood this idea that all these seemingly unrelated justice issues were not unrelated at all, but how vastly interconnected and important they all are. And that no one questioned it. It didn't matter what community we walked into, whether it was a largely white Unitarian Universalist church in Raleigh, or whether it was a largely Black AME gathering in New Orleans. Nobody questioned. It was deeply Blessed Unrest in action. I participated in a few of these stops, mostly to help with logistics and run tables for Dogwood Alliance. I did all kinds of things. I hung posters, I found spoons for covered dishes, I solved technical issues with microphones and assembled displays. I'm a little bit of jack of all trades, Jane of all trades, whatever. And other Dogwood Alliance staff attended some of the stops as well, helping in whatever way they could too. Reverend Leo had invited Dana to speak with him at most of the stops, along with others, to explain the plight of forests and the very real threat of industrial biomass that was cropping up in these communities' backyards all across the South. However, when we got to Savannah, Dana couldn't make it. And so I was invited to substitute for her as speaker. And the first evening there, we gathered at the Hudson Hill Community Center. And this community in its center in the shadow of International Paper's gigantic facility there near the port in Savannah. And there I met Dr. Mildred McLean, who, if you've ever met her, you'll never forget her. She's the executive director of the Harambe House and Citizens for Environmental Justice. And I had dinner with her and Leo and other community members and their families. And we also got to attend the graduation ceremony of 6 adults who just recently completed their coursework for different green jobs. That was an emotional graduation because these students were changing the course of their community and their history. And their families and their friends knew it, and they knew it. And it was an honor to be there. And I will say that Reverend Leo put me on the spot and asked me if I wanted to say the prayer. Which I did, but that kind of began a really fun history of Reverend Leo calling me to do things that I don't expect. The next day, communities gathered to celebrate Juneteenth. And if you don't know what that is, it's the date recognized as when slaves were told they were free, word having finally made it to slaves in Texas nearly 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation was signed. So Juneteenth is a big event at Wells Park in Savannah. And besides having a Justice First table there for Dogwood, which I ran with a coworker, I was slated to speak in the afternoon. I listened to the presentations, to the music from community leaders, including Dr. McLean herself, who spoke. And nervous for a variety of reasons, I was a little relieved when rain intervened. And then instead of speaking, I found myself going to Dr. McLean's Harambe house for a meeting of regional groups. In a hot room with one open window, as we listened to rain pouring down, about 15 community leaders across 2 states discussed environmental justice and, more importantly, funding for it. The conversation was an eye-opener for me. I heard firsthand the frustrations, distrust, and sometimes flat-out anger about traditional funding streams, and the systemic injustices that Black and Brown communities face in just trying to acquire the funding. It was clear that these communities needed and wanted resources that were their own, and that their experience with many foundations was one of too much red tape, lack of interest or understanding of their community's needs, and distrust in where the foundation money came from in the first place, and the underlying motivations for grant giving in general. And this is where I should say that as advancement director, all fundraising is actually under my oversight as well. And so this pricked my ears up for sure, because it's not something that I'd ever heard before. And I was affected by it for sure. It's a meeting that I'll never forget. And as Dr. McLean drove me back generously to the park in a downpour to retrieve my tabling supplies and my drenched coworker, I asked her what the solution was. And she gave a hearty ha, and she was driving speedily and avoiding potholes that I couldn't even see. And I was white knuckling it the whole time. She said, "We just keep asking the right questions. And we celebrate every victory, no matter how small, every single one." Little did any of us know where the Justice First tour would lead. In the 18 months since, so much has changed as a result. Dozens of community groups across the states that we've visited have become partners in other endeavors. Some battling pellet mill building and expansion permits across the South, and others coming together to protect the Atlantic coast, to protest the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, and others engaging in efforts to establish the Stand for Forest policies at the Georgia state level, which is super exciting. That we actually have bipartisan support for a Stand for Forest policy in Georgia. It's just mind-blowing. Those who've been part of the Justice First tour, including Reverend Leo and Dan, have spoken at U.S. congressional hearings and at legislative days. And recently, we're working together to help organize with other partners a Green New Deal for the South. Blessed Unrest is certainly growing. So those are the big sweeping examples, but Dr. McLean would remind me to celebrate the small things too, the value of individual impact. Take, for instance, these folks from Forrest Circle, which is a small group of mighty entrepreneurs who've been networking for 3 years across several states to learn alternative ways of sustaining their communities. In fact, the last time that they met, they shared knowledge about how to do earthen building and make chicken coops and things that they could do within their own communities to be self-sustaining. It was really wonderful. Or take the woman who in her 80s attended her first public hearing and gave a comment against Enviva's Loosedale mill in Mississippi, which is, if you remember, will be the largest mill in the world. So what are the implications of this work? Well, for Dogwood Alliance, we're learning that we need to question our systems and structures of white supremacy all the time. To be aware of our privilege and the responsibility of how we use it, and the overwhelming necessity to create equity. We've been told over and over again that our environmental work that we do is good, but actually, as long as it remains staunchly embedded in these systems, that it won't work. It won't work for the people, it won't work for the forests, it won't work for the planet. Certainly change includes becoming more diverse. And we talk about diversity all the time. And we used to talk about equality all the time. Now we need definitely to think about equity and not equality. And knowing that our best work and strategy will be guided by those who are affected the most, but that isn't enough. We need to reevaluate our structure, our way of operating, the way we use our resources, how we work to become an anti-racist organization. And now we're working to educate foundations and connect them with our partners, hearing each other's stories, making sure that these communities are being listened to, even as we work with them, such as those in the PD River Basin area, to explore economic solutions that put protection first and their communities first. On the bigger front, when we consider forests and climate change, we need to be moving towards rights of nature. Doing so now with the systems and structures we have in place is not impossible, but it is very difficult. And yet recognizing the rights of nature is recognizing our nature as well, because there's no separation. In the chapter, The Long Green, which I pulled the quote from, we need to be cutting lies instead of trees. You know, he talks about, Paul Hawken talks about kind of the differences between how Emerson went about quelling his desire or living into his desire to be a part of nature, which was largely intellectual, and that Thoreau just decided to go to a cabin and have this practical experience. And that really the basis for both of them was the same. It was this desire to get past this absolutely false barrier of separation that we have between ourselves and nature. And when we recognize those rights of nature, we're going to be recognizing our nature as well. And the more we uplift and respect the rights of nature, the more we do so for each other. We can emerge from this challenging time wholly changed and new. On the call with Leo the other night, we talked about COVID-19 and this time that we're living in. And he said that even though we can't come together like we did on the Justice First tour, that we can't march and protest and talk with one another in the same rooms, that we need more than ever to have a clear, unified voice, and that we must make good use of this opportunity as well as we can. We have to do it for our families and neighbors, and the people who are dying alone, the people who are overdosing, the communities who are suffering right now more than ever. We have to do it for the forests and all the living things that we share this planet with. We have to do it for each other. And instead of adjusting to what Leo calls the new abnormal, let's work together to make this world what it can and should be. We certainly have the time. And in the meantime, there are many stories, and there will be many more. Many faces, many hearts, many hands, many roots, many trees, and much blessed unrest. Thank you. I do have a couple of slides here that I promised as resources. So if you want to take the time and screenshot these, you're more than welcome to. Obviously, Dogwood Alliance with the Wetland Forest Initiative, and we talked about that strategy. the link for Burned Our Trees the New Coal. New Alpha Community Development Corporation, this is Reverend Leo's organization, and then the Harambe House, which is Dr. Mildred McLean. So I'll let you take a screenshot of that, and I have one more after this. So 5.
Holly?
Yes.
This is Adam. While we're doing that, why don't
Yeah.
we've got a few minutes left for questions,
Yep.
Q&A, so why don't we,
Go for it.
we can leave this on the screen so people can capture it, but
Sure.
why don't people just raise your hand and we'll take first come, first served if I understand the way this technology works, which I may not.
Exactly. I think I might actually have to close out my share screen in order to, oh, no, I can do that.
Yep, you can do that.
All right, so I don't see hands raised.
I don't either.
But who has a question?
Or a comment, observation?
I do see someone with iPhone. I do believe that you're there in the green jacket. Yes, the woman in the green parka. Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
Am I unmuted or do you hear
No,
me?
we can.
You're good.
This
can
is
hear you.
a voice from Finland, Holly.
Yes. Hello. This is Maria Strofuentes
Hi,
here
Maria.
again. I just don't get it how to get my name in there. And a fascinating speak. I'm doing gardening work while I'm listening to you. So I just wonder, when you're talking about creating alliances and the climate movement, how do you see that? Because this pellet business cross in a what would I say, like troubling way with the climate movement. So do you see any opening of bringing those together?
We are. So the climate movement, you know, it's one of the things that has been our task is how can we lift up the message of forests and their importance in the ongoing conversation of climate change and climate crisis, so that people understand that it's not just about, right, we have this thing we all know about fossil fuels and how important that is to get off fossil fuels. But in fact, that even if we take fossil fuels down, that the rate of concentration is actually going to be still increasing. And in order to deal with that increasing amount of carbon in the atmosphere, we need to keep our forests standing, which is what the Stand for Forests movement is really about, is keep those forests in the ground. And so we are partnering with other groups and we are being understood. And there are a lot of foundations that get it really clearly, that forests are indeed part of the climate change movement. So we do have a lot of support in that front for sure. And if you would like to, in fact, the very first report on here, which you can find on Dogwood Alliance, was written by Dana Smith, our executive director, and Dr. Bill Mumaw, who is IPCC scientist, the Great American Stand U.S. Forests and the Climate Emergency, which spells that out. Did that work, Maria, while you're gardening? Thank you.
Holly,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Ralph Baker has a question. How can we learn more about how the North Carolina Clean Energy Plan came about?
Yes. So you can definitely go to the government website. You can search for the Clean Energy Plan itself. Excuse me. We did a blog about it because we were involved from the very beginning in terms of they held a whole lot of listening sessions all across the state with different stakeholders. It was really kind of a fun moment because Enviva attended them all too, but Enviva didn't win in terms of getting their day with getting their side championed in the clean energy plan. So those are those two resources. There's a little bit in terms of the methodology that's in the report itself, in the plan itself, and then you can read about our level of participation on our website.
And Ralph has a follow-up question
Yes.
about where to learn more about what the Stand for Forest movement is doing.
Yes, so the Stand for Forest movement, we actually have a website, and if I'm still sharing my screen, I may or may not. It's the
You are.
www.standfor4forest.org. So it's standfor4forest.org, and you can read about that. And you can also join lots of endorsers from all over the place, including a lot of names you'll recognize.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. Someone is asking for you to go back to the previous slide for a moment. She didn't get a screenshot of it.
Yep, no problem.
And Bob LaBrie has a question. In your organizing work with communities, did you find that internet work and flesh and blood work were equally important?
Never.
So the online work was more important?
No.
No, just kidding.
Thanks, Adam. I think we're learning new ways, but there's nothing like hearing in person and working together in person. And we will get back to that. And boy, there's going to be a lot of hugs and a lot of high fives and a lot of dancing and a lot of sweating and a lot of everything when this is over with.
And there's one final quick question. Will the slideshow be available online?
We haven't talked about that, but for sure, and at least, so let me put this in there. So May 2nd, there's going to be a workshop that I'm going to be leading, and it's going to be We Interrupt This Empire, if you all recognize that chapter name. And I will have the voices of some of the folks in these communities that we've been working with join me. And we're going to be talking about how best to interrupt the empire by working together. And if it's not available before that workshop on May 2nd, then it will definitely, I will make it available then through a link.
Okay.
Anybody else?
That was wonderful, Holly. And again,
so
reminding people that Holly will be back for a workshop with some community members joining. We don't have the date set quite yet, but
I thought it was May 2nd.
Oh, is it? Okay.
Paula had said that earlier, so that's only why I'm repeating it.
Oh, okay. That's the workshop that you were referring to.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I missed that.
Okay.
Great. So May 2nd,
Thank you.
plenty of opportunity for conversations with Holly.
All right.
Thank you so much, Holly.